The cartography division had a reputation in the broader scientific community that its members found both accurate and slightly unfair. Accurate because the work was genuinely what people assumed it was: methodical, slow, data-heavy, producing results that were important in the long-term foundational sense rather than the immediately exciting sense. You sent probes into uncharted regions of space. You waited months, sometimes years, for the data to come back. You processed what arrived, cataloged what you found, updated the maps, and sent more probes. The galaxy was large, and the work was never finished, and the daily experience of doing it was closer to careful administration than dramatic discovery. Slightly unfair because the people who did this work understood something that outsiders tended to miss: that the careful administration was the point, and that the value of building an accurate picture of the Galaxy 1 data packet at a time was not diminished by the fact that most individual packets contained nothing remarkable. You did the work because the work mattered, and you trusted that the accumulation of it was worth more than any single finding. Dr. Webb had understood this for 22 years and had never once wished she was doing something else. She had joined the division straight out of her doctoral program, drawn by exactly the qualities that put other people off: the patience required, the long timelines, the absence of immediate gratification. She had a temperament that was well-suited to work that rewarded thoroughness over speed, and she had the specific kind of intellectual satisfaction that came from building a complete and accurate picture of something rather than grabbing the interesting pieces and leaving the rest unexamined. In 22 years, she had documented just over 4,000 star systems. She had found 11 planets with conditions capable of supporting life. None of the 11 had shown any sign of actually supporting it, which was statistically consistent with what the models predicted, and which she accepted without particular disappointment, because her job was to document what was there, not a hope for specific outcomes. She kept a running log of her career statistics on a small board above her desk. Not out of vanity, but out of the same instinct for documentation that drove everything else she did. Systems cataloged, probes deployed, data packets processed, the numbers updated automatically, and she glanced at them occasionally the way you glance at a clock, as a simple orientation tool rather than a source of meaning. On a Tuesday morning in the middle of an ordinary week, she arrived at her desk at the usual time, made coffee, and opened the overnight data queue to see what had come in while she was sleeping. Probe 7 Delta had returned a packet. This was not unusual. 7 Delta had been in transit for 14 months and had been returning regular data packets since it reached its survey zone 6 weeks earlier. The previous packets had contained the standard mix of material: stellar composition readings, gravitational mapping, the surface analysis of 3 rocky planets that were exactly as unremarkable as the preliminary data had suggested they would be, and had processed them efficiently and moved on. She opened a new packet and began working through the data in her standard sequence: stellar readings first, then system mapping, then planetary profiles in order of orbital position. The 3rd planet in the system stopped her. She was not sure at first exactly what made her stop. The initial data flag was subtle: an atmospheric composition reading that fell within a range for oxygen-nitrogen environments, which was notable but not unprecedented. She had seen similar readings before on 2 of the 11 potentially habitable planets she had documented, and both of those had turned out to be lifeless. She marked it and kept reading. The surface temperature range was within biological parameters. The presence of liquid water was confirmed at approximately 70% of the surface area. The albedo reading suggested a complex cloud system consistent with active weather patterns. Each individual data point was interesting, and each one had a possible innocent explanation that did not require the most significant conclusion. Then she reached the night side imaging. The probe's optical sensors had captured a full rotation of the planet, including its night hemisphere, in high-resolution composite imaging, and opened the night side image and looked at it. She sat completely still. The image showed the dark side of a planet covered in light. Not natural light, not volcanic activity or atmospheric phenomena or any of the other sources that could produce illumination on a planetary surface. This was structured light, organized light, a web of gold and white points and lines that covered every landmass visible on the night side, dense in some areas and more scattered in others, but present everywhere, reaching across the entire hemisphere from edge to edge without a significant gap. It was the light pattern of a civilization that had covered its planet, and looked at the image for 4 minutes. She did not move and she did not speak, and she was not doing nothing during those 4 minutes. She was going through every alternative explanation she could think of, methodically and honestly, giving each one a fair consideration. She had spent 22 years training herself not to jump to conclusions, and she was applying that training now with everything she had. She ran out of alternative explanations before the 4 minutes were up. She picked up her desk phone and called upstairs. Director Bob Hensley answered on the second ring with a slightly distracted tone of man in the middle of something administrative. Bob ran the division with a competent, unhurried manner of someone who had been doing it long enough to have seen most things, and who treated unexpected calls from his senior researchers with the appropriate mixture of attention and calm, and said, "You need to come see this." Something in her voice, not alarm, not excitement, just a particular quality of controlled certainty, made Bob set down whatever he was holding. She heard the small sound of it. "On my way," he said. He arrived 4 minutes later and stood at her shoulder and looked at the night-side image on her screen, and did not say anything while he looked. She had already said everything necessary. Bob was quiet for a long time, not processing quietly. She had worked with him for 16 years, and she knew the difference between Bob thinking something through and Bob sitting with the weight of something that did not require further thinking. This was the second kind. He had understood what he was looking at within the first 30 seconds, and the silence that followed was not analysis. It was something else. The specific quiet of a person who has just watched the boundaries of their professional world shift permanently and is taking a moment to acknowledge that before moving forward. He straightened up slowly. He walked the corner of her office where the emergency contact terminal sat on a small dedicated desk. The terminal had been installed when the division was founded and updated twice since then and used in the entire history of the division, exactly 0 times for its intended purpose. Most of the junior staff thought it was a legacy system that nobody had bothered to decommission. The senior staff knew better, but had never had reason to act on that knowledge. Bob sat down at the terminal and opened the encrypted contact directory. He found the number he was looking for, the one listed under first contact response, with the note beside it indicating it was a direct line to a team that had been maintained at full readiness for 30 years on the institutional assumption that the call would come eventually, even if everyone involved had privately wondered whether it ever would. He picked up the handset. He dialed. It rang twice before someone answered. The voice on the other end was alert and professional, the voice of someone whose job was to be ready for exactly this call, and who had been ready for a long time. Bob said, "This is Director Hensley, Cartography Division. I need to activate First Contact Protocol." A brief pause. Confirmed. The voice said, "Stand by." Bob set down the handset and looked across the room at N, who was still sitting at her desk, looking at the image of a planet covered in light. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say that the image had not already said more clearly. The First Contact Science Team had a protocol for this situation. That was the first thing Dr. Carol Sims said when the team assembled for its initial briefing, that there was a protocol, that the protocol was thorough, and that they were going to follow it completely and without shortcuts regardless of how long it took. The protocol existed because the people who had written it understood that first contact with an intelligent species was the kind of situation where the cost of getting it wrong was high enough to justify doing everything slowly and carefully even when the pressure to move faster was significant. The pressure to move faster was significant. Carol felt it from the first day and managed it the same way she managed most pressures, by acknowledging it was there, and then setting aside and doing the work at the pace the work required. She had been running the First Contact Science Division for 11 years. Before that, she had spent 15 years as a field researcher studying the early-stage civilizations that the cartography probes occasionally found. Not intelligent ones, but complex biospheres, ecosystems of the kind of organized biological activity that suggested certain trajectories. She had a talent for looking at a system and understanding what it was doing and where it was going, which was why she had been given this job, and why she took it seriously in a way that people take seriously the things they are genuinely good at. The team was 12 people, specialists in different disciplines: biology, linguistics, sociology, physics, communications analysis, cultural anthropology in the galactic sense. They set up in a dedicated facility with full access to probe data and everything that additional long-range observation assets could collect. And they began the work of building the most complete picture of humanity that 3 months of remote observation could produce. The first month was mostly data collection. More probes were repositioned to provide better coverage. Long-range observation assets were tasked to monitor the planet continuously across multiple spectra. The communications analysis team began the slow process of intercepting and cataloging the enormous volume of electromagnetic signals the planet was broadcasting, because the planet was broadcasting constantly across dozens of frequencies, in a volume that surprised even the communications specialists who had expected a high output based on the night-side imagery. Carol let the data accumulate without pushing for early conclusions. She had seen what happened when research teams formed hypotheses too early, and then spent the rest of their time confirming them rather than examining them. She wanted the picture to build itself before anyone decided what it meant. By the end of the first month, she had a general shape. By the end of the second month, she had something more detailed. By the end of the third month, she had enough to write the report. She wrote it over 2 weeks, working longer hours than she usually kept because the material kept generating more threads than she had anticipated, and she wanted to follow each one far enough to be confident she understood where it went. She was a precise writer, not academic in a way that produced dense, impenetrable sentences, but specific in a way that people are specific when accuracy matters more to them than impression. The report was 48 pages. She read it back 3 times before she submitted it, and each time she read it she had the same response, a quiet, settled certainty that the document was accurate, combined with separate awareness that accurate did not mean comfortable. The senior counsel received it on a Friday morning. Carol was not present for the reading. That was standard practice, giving the counsel time with the material before the questions and discussion began. Her liaison officer told her afterward that the room had been quiet throughout, not the polite quiet of a group performing attentiveness, the actual quiet of people reading something that was holding their full attention without effort. The civilization on the blue-green planet called itself humanity. It occupied a single world. One planet, one species, no established presence beyond a small outpost on the nearest moon and early-stage exploration of the neighboring planet. By the standard metrics the Council used to assess civilizations, at initial contact it was young. 200,000 years as an anatomically modern form, which was recent by galactic standards. Roughly 10,000 years of what its own records described as organized civilization, and approximately 100 years of what Carroll's report classified as serious technological development, the period during which the civilization had moved beyond pre-industrial methods and begun applying scientific understanding systematically to its material conditions. 100 years was a very short period of serious technological development. Most civilizations that the Council had encountered over its history showed development curves that were gradual and extended, progress measured in centuries and millennia, each advance building slowly on the previous ones, the kind of trajectory that allowed time for social and institutional structures to adapt alongside the technology. Humanity's curve was not that. Carroll had prepared a supplementary visualization section at the back of the report. The centerpiece of it was a single graph, development rate plotted against time, for every known spacefaring civilization in the Council's records, all normalized to the same timeline scale, so that comparisons were direct and honest. The other civilizations produced lines that were recognizable as lines, gradual upward slopes, some steeper than others, some with notable acceleration periods, but all of them moving in the manner of things that were growing over time with the organic variability of real processes. Humanity's line was different in kind rather than degree. Starting from the baseline of 100 years ago, it went up at an angle that Carol had triple-checked because her first instinct was that she had made an error. She had not made an error. In the span of time that most civilizations use to develop reliable ocean navigation, humanity had gone from early flight to orbital spaceflight. In the span of time that most civilizations use to develop reliable metallurgy, humanity had gone from basic nuclear fission to mapping the fundamental structure of biological life. The acceleration was not just fast. It was consistent, not slowing as it reached more complex territory, not showing plateau periods that every other civilization's curve showed when it hit the natural friction points of development. The curve looked, to Carol's eye and apparently to the Council's eye as well, like a wall. something that went up rather than forward, something that the standard graph scale was not quite built to represent accurately. She had added one line at the bottom of the graph, below the legend and the axis labels, in plain text. If this rate of development continues unchanged, standard first contact protocols may be inadequate within 50 years. She had debated including that line. It was an inference rather than a documented fact, and she was careful about the boundary between the two. But she had decided that the graph without the line was incomplete in a way that mattered, that the data was pointing at a conclusion clearly enough that failing to name the conclusion would be a kind of dishonesty, and she was not willing to be dishonest about what she had found, even when being honest about it was uncomfortable. The council had read that line, and the room had stayed quiet for longer than the rest of the report had kept it quiet. Carol's liaison officer said the silence after that line lasted almost a full minute before anyone spoke. She thought about that when she was preparing for the presentation session, about what a room full of experienced galactic diplomats and scientists sat with for a full minute before they were ready to start talking. She thought she probably already knew the answer. She prepared her presentation notes and waited to be called in. The full council session was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, and the chamber filled earlier than usual. That was the first sign that the report had done what Carol had expected it to do. Council sessions on new civilization discoveries typically drew the standard attendance, the assigned delegates, their immediate staff, a handful of observers from relevant scientific bodies. This session had people in the overflow gallery. Species that had not been directly involved in the science team's work had sent senior representatives rather than junior ones. The communications traffic in and out of the council station in the 48 hours since the report had been distributed had been, according to Carol's liaison officer, significantly higher than baseline. People had read the report. People had talked to each other about the report. People had come to this session with opinions already formed and were here to find out what everyone else's opinions were. Carol sat in the observer section with her materials and watched the chamber fill and thought about the graph on the last page of her report and the one line she had written below it. The session opened with a formal summary of findings delivered by the council science liaison, a competent official who covered the key data points accurately and without the editorializing that Carol had deliberately avoided in the written report. It took about 40 minutes. The chamber listened in the attentive, slightly tense way of a group that already knew the material and was waiting for the part where they got to respond to it. When the summary finished, the moderator opened the floor, and the chamber produced exactly what Carol had anticipated. Not a discussion, but a simultaneous emergence of multiple conversations that the moderator had to work fairly hard to organize into something sequential. The positions sorted themselves out within the first hour into roughly 3 groups. The first group wanted immediate contact. Their argument was practical and had a clear internal logic. A civilization developing at this rate was not going to remain undiscovered for long regardless of what the council did, and the council's interests were better served by being the ones who initiated the relationship rather than being found by a species that had reached galactic capability on its own and had not been warned that anyone was out here. Get ahead of it. Make the introduction now, on terms the council could shape, before the terms were set by circumstances nobody could control. The second group wanted more time, more observation, more data, more certainty before any irreversible step was taken. They were not wrong that more data was generally better, and Carol respected the instinct even when she thought the timeline argument was stronger than the caution argument in this particular case. The third group was quieter than the other two and harder to characterize from their formal statements, because their formal statements were not quite saying what their informal conversations were saying. Carol had been in enough institutional settings to recognize the gap between what people said in official proceedings and what they said in the corridors outside them, and the gap in this case was noticeable. Ambassador Roy Price had apparently been noticing it too. Roy was a senior delegate who had been in the council chamber for longer than most of the current membership and who had developed, over that time, a specific kind of patience with diplomatic indirection, the patience of someone who had watched it waste significant amounts of time on enough occasions to have a clear-eyed view of what it cost. He was not aggressive, and he was not unkind. He was simply direct in a way that some people found refreshing and others found uncomfortable, and he had apparently decided by the midpoint of the session that the comfortable version of this conversation had gone on long enough. He requested the floor during a transition between speakers and got it. He stood up and looked around the chamber for a moment before he spoke. Some of you, he said, want to contain them. The chamber went quiet in the specific way it went quiet when someone said the true version of something that had been circling the room in softer forms for an hour. Not shocked quiet, more like the quiet of a collective exhale, the release of tension that comes when a thing that everyone knows gets named out loud. Before they get any bigger, Roy continued, at the same unhurried pace. While the gap between their capability and ours is still wide enough to make it feasible. I've been listening to the side conversations and reading what's underneath the careful language in some of these formal statements, and I think we should be honest about what we're actually discussing rather than continuing to discuss it in terms that obscure what it is. He sat back down. The moderator did not immediately call the next speaker because the next speaker had not yet raised their hand. The chamber sat with Roy's words for a moment. Then a hand went up from a younger end of the delegate seating, a section that tended toward junior representatives, species with smaller presences in the council, coordinators, and analysts who attended sessions but did not always contribute to floor discussion. The delegate who stood up was Coordinator Gail Marsh. She was young enough that Carol did not recognize her from previous sessions, which meant she was either new to her position or new to attending at this level. She had the slightly careful posture of someone who was aware that speaking from where she was sitting was not the most common thing, but she held it and spoke clearly. "I have a question for containment argument," she said, "not for Ambassador Price. I think he described it accurately for the people in the room who hold that position." She paused for just a second. "Has anyone looked at their history? Not the technology report. The actual history. What the species does when someone tries to contain them." She sat down. The chamber was quiet. Carol looked around the room. The delegates who had been making the containment argument in their formal statements and their corridor conversations were doing various versions of the same thing, consulting with the people beside them, looking at their materials, producing the specific body language of people who had been asked a question they had not prepared an answer for. Nobody spoke for a moment that stretched longer than was comfortable. Carol looked down at the bag beside her chair. Inside was a document she had prepared over the same 3 months as the primary report, running parallel to it, drawing on the same data sources, and adding several more. She had not been asked to prepare it. She had prepared it because she was thorough, and because the primary report had kept generating questions that the primary report scope was not designed to answer, and the most persistent of those questions was the one Gail Marsh had just asked from the floor. She had titled it plainly, Human Conflict History, a Summary. It was 112 pages long. It was the longest single document she had written in her career, which was a career that had produced a significant volume of long documents. The length was not padding. She had cut it substantially in the editing process, removing anything that was repetitive or that the data did not clearly support. What remained after the cutting was 112 pages, because the subject required 112 pages to cover honestly. She had brought it to the session in case it became relevant. It had become relevant. She reached into the bag and took out the document, and set it on the desk in front of her and looked at the moderator. The moderator saw her, looked at what she had placed on the desk, looked back at the chamber, which was still sitting in the quiet that Gail Marsh's unanswered question had produced. Then the moderator nodded at Carol and gave her the floor. Carol stood up. She looked around the chamber at 42 species, waiting for an answer to a question that nobody had been able to answer from their seats. "I prepared a second report," she said, "alongside the primary one. I think this is the right moment to present it." She opened the document to the first page. The chamber settled into a new kind of quiet, the focused, attentive quiet of a room that had just understood it was about to receive information it was not going to find easy to sit with. Carol began. The closed session was held the morning after the full council debate, and the room was smaller and quieter by design. 12 people. Senior council members only, the delegates who held actual decision-making authority for their species, rather than the advisory and observer roles that filled the larger chamber. No overflow gallery. No junior staff. The moderator had sent a notice the previous evening specifying that the session was restricted and that the materials to be presented were not for general distribution until the council had decided how to handle them. Carol had been told she would have the floor for as long as she needed. She arrived early and set up her materials at the presentation station with the methodical thoroughness she brought to all preparation work. The second report was 112 pages, and she had no intention of presenting all 112 pages. She had prepared a structured summary that covered the essential findings in a sequence that built correctly, each section establishing the foundation for the one that followed. She had learned over years of presenting research to decision-making bodies that the structure of a presentation mattered as much as the content, because even accurate information delivered in the wrong order produced incomplete understanding. The delegates filed in over the following 15 minutes and took their seats with a quiet, focused manner of people who had been told they were about to hear something important and had come prepared to pay full attention. Carol noticed that several of them had brought the primary report, her first report, the technology assessment, and had it open on the desk beside them, which suggested they were planning to cross-reference as she spoke. Ambassador Don Hale came in last and sat at the far end of the table without making any particular entrance. He was a tall, spare man with the kind of stillness that came from having spent 30 years in rooms where things mattered and learning to conserve energy for the moments that required it. Carol had encountered him twice in previous council contexts and had formed the assessment that he was the kind of diplomat who was more dangerous when he was quiet than when he was speaking, because the quiet meant he was thinking, and the thinking tended to produce observations that reoriented the room. Carol opened without preamble. She explained what the second report was: a comprehensive historical analysis of human conflict across their recorded civilization, compiled from the same communication signals and data sources as the primary report, supplemented by additional analysis of historical records that had been encoded in the signals the science team had been collecting. She explained that she had prepared it in parallel with the primary report because it became clear early in the research process that understanding humanity's technological development without understanding the context in which that development had occurred would produce an incomplete and potentially misleading picture. Then she began. The structure she had chosen started with the broadest view and moved inward. At the broadest view, the finding was simple and could be stated in one sentence. Humanity had been engaged in armed conflict somewhere on its planet for virtually the entirety of its recorded civilization, with only brief and irregular periods of complete global peace. She stated this plainly and did not editorialize, because the statement did not require editorializing. It was a fact, and the room could respond to it as a fact. She then narrowed to the scale and variety of conflicts: small engagements between neighboring groups, regional wars involving multiple political entities, global conflict of a scale that the Council's historical records of other civilizations suggested should have been civilization-ending, and had been, for some of the civilizations the Council had encountered at comparable developmental stages. Humanity had experienced two conflicts of global scale within a single century. Both had ended. Humanity had continued. She put the first graph on the screen. Conflict frequency mapped against time, showing that the rate of conflict had not decreased as the civilization developed. It had changed in character, becoming less frequent in certain forms while becoming more concentrated and intense in others. The pattern was not what most models of civilizational development predicted. The prediction was that conflict decreased as civilizations matured. For humanity, this prediction was not supported by the data. Several delegates were writing notes. Carol continued. The next section was the one she had spent the most time on during the writing process, because it was a finding that most required careful presentation to be understood correctly. Humanity's conflicts had not simply been survived. They had, in the majority of documented cases, served as acceleration events for the civilization's development. She was precise about this. She was not arguing that conflict was beneficial or that humanity had chosen it for this reason. She was documenting a pattern in the data. The pattern was that the periods of most rapid technological and organizational development in human history followed, with notable consistency, periods of significant conflict. She put the second graph on the screen. Technological development rate overlaid on conflict timeline. The correlation was visible without statistical analysis. Every major leap in the development curve that had made the first report's graph look like a wall had a corresponding conflict event in the preceding period. The room was quiet in the way it had been quiet since she started. The focused, still quiet of people processing information they were taking seriously. Carol continued through the remaining sections. The organizational resilience data, how quickly human civilizations had rebuilt after major conflicts, in most cases exceeding their pre-conflict capability within a generation. The innovation patterns, the specific types of development that conflict had historically accelerated, which included not just weapons technology but medicine, communications, logistics, material science, organizational structure. The record of how human political entities had responded to existential threats, not with capitulation or fragmentation, but with consolidation and acceleration. She finished the summary and stood quietly while the room processed it. Don Hale had not written anything during the presentation. He had his hands flat on the table in front of him and his eyes on the screen where her last graph was still displayed, and he had the expression of someone who had been thinking continuously throughout and had arrived somewhere specific. He raised his hand. Carol nodded at him. Don looked at her with a direct, undecorated attention. He gave the things he considered important. "One question," he said. His voice was even and unhurried. "In everything you have just presented, the entire conflict history, all of it, has humanity ever faced a threat from outside? Something that originated externally rather than from within their own species?" Carol looked at him. She had expected questions about the methodology, about the data sources, about the interpretation of specific findings. She had not specifically anticipated this question, which meant it had come from somewhere in Don's thinking that her presentation had not directly addressed. She considered it honestly for a moment to make sure she was answering accurately. "No," she said. "Everything documented in their conflict history is internal. Every war, every major engagement, every existential level conflict, all of it has been between human groups. One part of humanity against another part of humanity." She paused. "There is no record of any external threat to the species in the period covered by the report." Don nodded, slowly, once. He looked at the graph on the screen for a moment. The development curve, the conflict timeline, the correlation between the two that ran through the entire history like a pattern in fabric, once you saw where to look for it. Then he looked back at Carol. "Then we have no data," he said quietly, "on how they respond when the threat comes from somewhere else, from outside rather than from within." He let that sit for a second. "We know how they respond to internal conflict. The record is thorough and it is consistent. They accelerate. They rebuild. They emerge more capable than before." Another pause. "But the external threat scenario has never occurred. We have no data point for it. We are reasoning by extrapolation from an internal conflict model and hoping the external model produces the same curve." The room was very still. Given everything in this report, Don said, "I would suggest that testing that extrapolation experimentally is not the approach we want to take. Finding out how humanity responds to an external existential threat by becoming that external threat is not a risk calculation that comes out well for anyone in this room." He set his hands flat on the table again and stopped talking. The room stayed still for a long time. Carol looked around at 12 senior delegates, sitting with the specific quiet of people who had just heard an argument they could not find a flaw in and were sitting with the implications of that. Nobody was writing notes anymore. Nobody was cross-referencing the primary report. They were just sitting with it. Carol had prepared a brief, concluding statement for the end of her presentation. She looked at her notes and then looked at the room and decided that the concluding statement was unnecessary. The room had arrived when material was pointing. Saying more would add words without adding anything else. She closed her notes. "That's everything in the report," she said simply. "I'm available for questions." Nobody had a question. The room stayed quiet for another long moment. Then the moderator thanked Carol and indicated that the council would move into closed deliberation. Carol gathered her materials and walked out of the room. Behind her, the door closed and the deliberation began, and she did not know what was said in that room over the hours that followed. She would not know until the vote was announced. She went back to her office and made coffee and sat at her desk and looked at the notes she had made during the preparation of the second report. 112 pages of documented pattern, all pointing at the same unanswered question that Don Hale had named more precisely and more concisely than she had managed in all 112 pages. She sat with it and waited to find out what the council was going to do. The vote was held on a Thursday morning, and it was not close. That surprised some people and did not surprise others. Council votes on significant matters had a history of being contentious. Long debates, narrow margins, the kind of split decisions that required extensive follow-up negotiation to implement. The people who had expected this vote to follow that pattern had not fully accounted for the effect of Carroll's second report on the chamber's overall mood. The second report had done something that Carroll had not specifically designed it to do, but that the material had produced naturally. It had taken the containment argument and examined it against the historical record and found that the historical record did not support in any version that ended well. Not because the council lacked the capability, in principle, to slow down or complicate humanity's development trajectory, but because the record of what humanity did when it encountered organized opposition to its expansion and progress was consistent enough and thorough enough that the risk calculation for containment position came out negative every way you ran it. 41 species voted for immediate, transparent, peaceful first contact. 1 species abstained. Their delegate, a quiet and careful representative named Coordinator Beth Larson, explained that her government needed additional consultation time before committing to a formal position, and that the abstention was not opposition, but process. Everyone accepted this without friction, because Beth had always been honest about her government's decision timelines, and the distinction between needing more time and opposing the outcome was a real one. Nobody voted against. The chamber documented the vote and moved directly into the planning phase, which was where Roy Price made his second significant contribution of the week. He proposed that the mission be led by a diplomat rather than a scientist or a military officer, on the grounds that the first impression humanity received of galactic civilization should be unambiguously peaceful in its framing, and that a diplomat was structurally the clearest way to communicate that framing. This was agreed without significant debate. The diplomat selected was Ambassador Jeff Cole. Jeff had been in the Council's diplomatic service for 28 years and had led 7 previous first contact missions, all with species at significantly earlier developmental stages in humanity. He was known in the service for 2 qualities that his supervisors consistently noted in his reviews: patience and accuracy. He had a way of reading situations correctly, including situations where the correct reading was not the comfortable one, and a way of adjusting his approach to match what was actually in front of him rather than what he had expected to find. He accepted the assignment the same day it was offered and requested Carroll's 2 reports immediately. He read both of them once that evening. Then he read them again the following morning. He read them a 3rd time during the transit preparation period, making notes in the margins of the physical copies he had printed because he found that he retained material better when he could annotate it by hand. By the time the mission vessel was ready for departure, he had read both documents 4 times, and his copies were thoroughly marked up with questions, observations, and the specific kind of notes that a person makes when they're trying to understand something at a level deeper than the surface. He told Carroll before departure that the second report was the most important thing he had read in his professional career. Carroll thanked him and said she hoped it would prove useful. Jeff said he was fairly certain it already had. The mission vessel departed on a Friday. The transit took 11 days. Jeff used the time to continue his preparation, reviewing everything the science team had collected on human communication patterns, social structures, political organization. He paid particular attention to the communications analysis section, which covered the electromagnetic signals humanity had been broadcasting into space for the past 70-plus years. The volume and variety of those signals was extraordinary. Music, news, scientific data, entertainment, personal communications, government broadcasts, an unfiltered continuous transmission of civilization talking to itself and deliberately and specifically reaching outward into the void. The reaching outward part had been documented in its own section of the science team's materials. Humanity had been sending targeted signals into space for approximately 70 years. Not accidental leakage from surface communications, but deliberate transmissions, pointed at regions of space that the senders had assessed as potentially habitable, constructed with mathematical content and pattern structures that were clearly designed to be recognizable as intentional by any receiving intelligence. Jeff had read this section 3 times specifically. He kept coming back to it because it said something about humanity that the technology report and the conflict history report, taken together, did not fully capture on their own. A species with humanity's development rate and humanity's conflict history, choosing to spend 70 years sending careful, patient signals into a void that never answered. That combination of qualities did not fit into any single category his experience had given him. He was still thinking about it when the mission vessel came out of transit and began its approach to the blue-green planet. The vessel broadcast peaceful intentions on every frequency the science team had identified as monitored by humanity. It broadcast continuously, repeating the signal in multiple mathematical and linguistic formats, giving the receiving end as many entry points into the message as possible. Jeff had approved the broadcast content personally and had made one small adjustment to the science team's original draft. He had added a direct acknowledgement that the Council had been aware of humanity's existence for some months and had taken time to prepare this approach carefully, because he thought transparency about the timeline was better than leaving it to be discovered later. The first day passed without a response. Jeff had expected this and was not concerned. Receiving an unexpected signal from space and deciding how to respond to it was not a simple process, and he did not want a species that was known for careful verification to feel rushed. He maintained the broadcast and waited. The second day passed without a response. Still not concerned. Still waiting. On the third day, at approximately mid-morning station time, the communication board activated. Jeff was at his desk reviewing his notes when his communications officer, Captain Dan Reed, called through to tell him they had an incoming signal on one of the frequencies they had been broadcasting on. Clean, clear, structured. Definitely intentional. Definitely a response. Jeff walked to the bridge at a pace that was faster than his normal pace and sat down at the communication station. He looked at the signal characteristics for a moment. Then he opened the channel. The voice that came through was male, professional, and completely steady. No hesitation. No audible stress. The voice of someone doing a job they had prepared for and were performing with the focused calm of a person who understood the significance of the moment and had decided that significance was best honored by doing the job well. This is Earth. We read you clearly. Please confirm your intentions. Jeff confirmed peaceful contact. He introduced himself, his species, and the Galactic Council in the plain, direct language he had prepared over 11 days of transit. He explained what the Council was and what membership it involved. And he extended, formally and on behalf of the 41 species that had voted 3 weeks earlier, an invitation for humanity to join. He finished and waited. The pause lasted about 30 seconds. Jeff watched the seconds pass on the station clock and did not fill them with anything. Then the human voice came back. Same tone, same steadiness, and words that Jeff would describe later as the moment, the entire preparation period, the months of science work, the council debate, the 11 days of transit, all of it, suddenly resolved into something that felt both completely unexpected and, in retrospect, entirely inevitable. We've been wondering when someone would answer. The voice said, we've been sending signals for 70 years. Jeff sat with those words for a moment. 70 years of signals sent into a void that never answered. 70 years of patient, deliberate outreach from a species that had also, in those same 70 years, been developing at a rate that made the rest of the galaxy look like it was standing still. And the voice reporting this, the voice of a species that had every reason to be frustrated or guarded or demanding after 70 years of silence, was calm, professional, carrying no accusation and no edge. Just a statement of fact delivered by someone who had been waiting a long time and was glad the wait was over. Jeff looked at his crew. His communications officer was looking back at him with an expression that said he had heard the same thing Jeff had heard and was having a similar response to it. The 2 other crew members on the bridge were both quiet in the way that people are quiet when something has landed that they need a moment with. Jeff opened the channel. Welcome to the conversation, he said. We have a great deal to discuss. In the council chamber, the live feed was playing on the main display screen, and the room was full, because word had got around that the approach window was today, and nobody who had read the reports wanted to miss the moment of response. Ambassador Don Hale was sitting in his usual position, watching the feed with the same steady attention he brought to everything. He had read both of Carol's reports more than once. He had voted yes on the first contact motion with the settled certainty of someone who had done the analysis and knew where it came out. He heard Tom Grant's words, the 70 years, the calm, the complete absence of accusation in a statement that had every right to contain some, and he sat with him the quiet that fell over the chamber as the words registered across 42 species simultaneously. The room stayed quiet for a long time after Jeff's response went out, longer than the moment technically required. Nobody was in a hurry to break it because it was a kind of quiet that deserved to exist for its natural duration, The quiet of a room that understood it was sitting at the dividing line between a before and an after, and was taking a moment to be present in that specific place before moving forward into whatever came next. Don thought about the second report, about the unanswered question at its center, the one about a species that had never faced an external threat, and what that meant about the data they did not have. The question was still unanswered. It would remain unanswered until circumstances answered it, and circumstances might never answer it in the way that would make the answer visible, which was itself a kind of answer. He thought that what he had just heard, 70 years of patient signals, zero accusation, complete steadiness, was data, not the data the question had been asking for, but data about what kind of species was on the other end of that channel, data about what they valued and how they expressed it and what they considered important enough to spend 70 years doing in the dark without any confirmation that it mattered. He thought this was either the best possible version of the story that Carroll's two reports had been building toward, or it was the beginning of a chapter that the Council's existing frameworks were not quite built to contain. He sat with a genuine uncertainty of not knowing which one it was. Then the chamber began to stir around him, the natural movement of a room coming back to itself after a significant moment, people turning to each other, the low sound of conversation starting, and Don turned his attention back to feed, where Jeff Cole's mission vessel was receiving a second transmission from Earth, and a conversation that had taken 70 years to begin was finding its footing. It was going to be a long conversation. Don thought that was probably exactly right.